Okay. Hello all. My name is Bill Solecki. We are in the first session, session 1B, Building Community Resilience 1. We'll wait another minute or two just to make sure all possible attendees are here, and then we'll get going. Okay, I'm going to just say a few intro comments about the session, and then we'll probably begin shortly thereafter. Thanks certainly for all the folks in the session and attendees. As noted, so this is session 1B, Building Community Resilience 1. We have a great set of papers focused on different aspects of this question. There will be 5 presentations. Each presentation is requested to present or to think about presentation period of about 12 minutes, which should include time, if possible, for 1 or 2 clarifying questions. I'll try to keep time keep in terms of process and make sure that we finish on the hour. Just as in advance, I have a hard stop at noon, so I'll have to disappear at that point as well. Just as a quick question to any of the presenters, any other process questions that you have? Great. Okay, so maybe we'll begin. Also do the caveat. I have my computer sometimes crashes, so I think it should be okay, but just FYI, if I disappear, I'll come back, I promise. Also, I have 2 dogs that are waiting for the mailman to arrive, or the mail person, I think. So if you hear loud barking, I'll be on mute. Anyway, with that, let's plow into the presentations, and I'm really excited to hear these presentations. There's a sequence of these over the course of the day. This is the first, and then there's I think 2 other sessions on this topic as well, building community resilience. So first up, we have the power of frontline leaders to shape our future, and then Kristin Marcell from Climigration Network will present. And Kristin, as you probably know, you can screen share and do all the other sort of functionalities that you can.
Thank you, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Wonderful. It's so great to be here with everyone this morning. I'm going to use this time to share a little bit about where the Climigration Network has come in the last couple of years and how important conversations with frontline leaders have been in shaping our future, and how important I think they are in shaping our collective future for how we address this challenge. Oh no. There we go. Okay. So a little bit about the Climigration Network. We were founded in 2016. Carrie Hewlett, who I'm sure many of you have heard speak, was largely responsible for lifting the network up, and it is hosted by the Consensus Building Institute. It is composed of primarily volunteer practitioners and people with lived experience with climate risk. We produce a newsletter every other week that summarizes all the latest information on the press and published papers and job opportunities and events. So I encourage you to check out our website if you're interested in signing up for that. We also have 5 topic-based work groups that are working on addressing the challenges and the barriers that communities are facing in relocation. So some of the hard lessons that we've had to learn over the last 6 months or so. When I came into this position, we were just embarking on a strategic planning process. And one of the pieces, the components of that process that we felt very strongly about was an opportunity to speak with community leaders, to interview them and use the lessons we could learn through those interviews to shape our work plan. I'm sure COVID, the pandemic, played a huge role in how challenging we found that, but it seemed like there was a bigger problem. There seemed to be an enormous gap between us as practitioners and the communities we were seeking to reach. We had funding to seek 20 interviews, and we were able to create 3 of those interviews. Since then, it's become much more clear to us how challenging that original prospect was. And we've come into dialogue now with community leaders from 16 communities. We've learned a lot about how difficult it is to talk about relocation, and I know we'll explore a lot of that over the next 4 days. And we've learned that it's actually very challenging to engage communities with organizations that look like ours. There's a history of organizations that look like ours extracting information and not creating value for the communities themselves and not compensating them for their time. So we had to take a different approach, and we were very grateful to have 3 organizations, the Alaska Institute for Justice, the Anthropocene Alliance, and the Lowlander Center in our network and in our leadership. So we regrouped and we partnered with them. We shared that some of the funding that we had to co-create a new approach to engage frontline leaders together and use that information in order to shape the work plan and our approach going forward. And our hope is to build partnerships with frontline leaders where community leaders and practitioners are working together to address the needs for relocation. All of these conversations have greatly informed our mission and our vision. These are new statements that have really just come into shape in the last couple of months, but we feel very strongly about them. We've deeply committed to moving community-led models forward for relocation and trying to create real partnerships between compensated, lived experience experts and practitioners in our field. Our hope is that we can create approaches that are supportive, where people who want to consider relocation, who do ultimately decide to move, can land in safe, welcoming places, and that the land that they leave behind is honored and accessible to them going forward into the future. We're very grateful for our funders and partners, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, the Summit Foundation, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. The Anthropocene Alliance, one of our very powerful partners, is an amazing organization. It's led by Harriet Festing, and it's a network of 81 community members across the United States, all struggling not just with flooding and drought and fire, but also with a variety of other issues. And they're helping to raise funding for these communities to do the work themselves. And that's really an important piece of how to approach this work. We've been so grateful to partner with them, and we're working on a statement from the frontline leaders based on the dialogues that we've had over the last 4 months. It's a draft statement, but I have permission to use a couple of excerpts today. This particular excerpt is the one that I think is the most important for everyone to really consider. A lot of decisions that are being made about relocation in the United States are being made without the real input and dialogue with the communities that are facing the risk every day. And this quote says it all. Everyone is making decisions about how to address the issues we are facing, but no one's having conversations with us about solutions and our experience protecting our own homes. We're hoping to change that. This is another one that I thought was really important to share today. I can't tell you how many times this topic has come up in our dialogue. And we know, and we'll hear many times over the course of these 4 days about research that has proved that communities of color are not receiving the same level of support as white communities or wealthier communities. And this quote I found so powerful, and I just felt it was really important to share today. I think it's important for us to recognize that communities that we are hoping will consider relocation often don't have good places to go because they've lost their property values, have gone down over time because of local government decisions that have affected their future and increased their flood risk. And there's a whole host of inequities over history that have affected their reality. They love the places that they live though, and they don't want to leave them. But if they have to, we have to create much more supportive systems to address the needs that they face. The last thing I want to share with you is a guidebook, and we'll be talking about this in the next session. Michael Estrada and Hannah Teicher of our network will be sharing this along with myself. This is a really important piece of work that we're bringing out in a public event on July 15th. It's been led by an amazing communications consulting team led by Scott Shigoka and Michael Estrada, who I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in exploring work in this field. It's based on insights from over 40 people facing lived experience with climate displacement and risk. And we hope that it sets a new tone for how to have these conversations, one that's based on honesty, empathy, curiosity, with a slight dose of optimism if we can get there. But we hope the insights that are in this and some of the actions that it provides will help people start those conversations. And that's really important, to slow down, begin dialogue, and address the real needs of the communities that are facing this climate risk and displacement. You can register for the workshop at the bottom at the link there, or just go to our website if you're looking for more information. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristin. We have a moment or two if there's any questions, follow-up questions or clarifying questions. Great. One could also use the chat, to communicate with Kristin, and use that as a forum moving forward for other conversations. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Unless there's other points to raise? No. Okay. Maybe we'll move on. There will be time certainly at the end to sort of, as the presentations come together as a group, to ask questions that sort of thread between them. So let's go on to the next presentation. This is the long goodbye on a disappearing ancestral island, a just retreat from Ile de Jean Charles, sorry, which includes a set of presenters involved in it, or at least organizing the presentation. Jessica Sims, Chris Brunet, Pamela Jenkins, and Helen Waller. So I'm not sure who is going to be presenting this one. Who is the presenter on this? I don't have the information. Is it Helen? Is it you?
We'll start with Jessica Sims.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know that. Okay, very good. So Jessica, please. And maybe a question to the group. Will all presenters be involved? So, or just the two of you?
Jessica, Helen, and Chris will all be speaking.
Okay, great, excellent.
And Chris is joining in over phone.
Perfect, okay.
Okay, good morning. Sorry, I was having some audio issues. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Fabulous.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Good morning, afternoon rather. So for those of us who are here at this conference, we understand that drafting managed retreat policies that are equitable and just, as Kristin just reminded us, for those residents who are or who are willing to be relocating are essential. Today, we're going to talk about the US's first federally funded community scale climate driven resettlement, an unprecedented endeavor. And
You're frozen.
I am.
Oh, there you go.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. So this is the resettlement of Ile-de-Jean-Charles. Once encompassing more than 22,000 acres, only 320 acres of the island remain today. In January 2016, HUD awarded the state of Louisiana $48.3 million to plan, design, and implement a just, structured, and scalable resettlement with former and current Ile-de-Jean-Charles residents, one of whom is presenting with us today, Chris Brunet. We often hear in conferences from practitioners, but for this presentation and in the paper that this presentation is based on, we'll be highlighting local knowledge. So Chris is currently in the process of undergoing this resettlement, and he lives on Ile-de-Jean-Charles currently, along with about 50 or so other people who are also multi-generational like Chris. Chris's family dates back 7 or 8 generations. And because of residents' strong ties to the island, policy changes in this resettlement that are dramatically different from the standard buyout policies were drafted. So in this case, the properties and the land from which residents are departing will remain in their possession as long as the island remains. So this intangible connection to place, feelings of belonging, lifestyle, family connections, and culture plays a central role in many families' decisions to stay or go. As I said, this is the first federally funded coastal resettlement program. The island was excluded from a hurricane protection system in Louisiana. That photo on the left, top left, is of Island Road. That's the only way to get in or out by car. And now I'm going to let Helen and Chris take it away.
So I think a number of folks on the call have probably heard a lot about the overarching themes of this program and how it started. But I think, Chris, could you tell us how you first heard about the grant award and what were your thoughts first hearing about it? And Chris, you might be on mute.
How about now? Okay.
We got you. There you are.
All right. My name is Chris Brunet, and I first heard of the grant from our traditional chief of the island tribe, which is Chief Albert Nakam. And then from there, I started hearing more about it from the Office of OCD. And whenever I first heard about it, I wasn't sure about it. My mind wasn't made up whether or not to go. Nobody really wants to leave Ile-de-Jean-Charles, but it comes down to a decision. And so I really waited until 2020 to actually make up my mind to say, yes, I'll be part of the resettlement. But I was able to participate in the community meetings that the Office of OCD held. And so with that, for that question right there, I'll leave it for that.
Sure. So there were a whole lot of meetings that were held over the course of this grant. Starting with a long series of interviews, there were design charades and workshops, especially in the early days, bi-monthly phone calls to kind of keep folks abreast of challenges that were coming up and the conversations that were being had. And later on, there was the development of a steering committee following the charades. And this was all kind of woven through with weekly or bi-weekly visits by folks from the state down to the island. So Chris, you spoke some about those meetings, but can you tell us what, how you've come to think about that process and those conversations?
For me, I'm glad that the process hasn't moved along too quick. I'm glad that it actually afforded me time to think about this because being Native American of Chittimacha Choctaw identity and us going back, to that place, knowing about Allergy Charles and living there, going back 7 or 8 generations. It's like it's been a challenge for me because I never lived no other place but there, and that would go back, to my parents and like 3 of my other grandparents and on and on, So for me, hearing that there's a possibility I'd be living somewhere else, well, that's kind of new to me. So I'm not confused or nothing or whatnot, but it's just I'm really trying to open up myself to how to deal with that. And so I think that at the timing of how this project is opening out, it has afforded me that. And I would like to thank Ms. Kristin Marcell for the words she said in her opening statements, that the sensitivity to this place being home to us. So I would like to extend a thanks for them words, because for me, that's where all it just begins at, because it is so much part of who I am, my identity, and what I could define as my culture.
Yeah. And certainly in my memory and possibly everybody's memory of this process, there was one issue that really came to the fore, while we're trying to talk about new houses and talk about where folks want to live, was the issue of what to do with the land and the homes that folks were leaving. As I'm sure maybe everybody here is familiar, current policy for folks that are moving with federal assistance is to tear down homes and turn them into green space. And very quickly, it became apparent that was not going to be the right answer for this process. Chris, what about this particular issue stands out in your memory, and how do you remember kind of pushing for policy change as you move through?
Thinking about it, I'm glad that the word unprecedented was tacked to this resettlement with this $48 million, because it is not a lotto, it is not a celebration, but it is a response to the changes of the environment that is happening in the southern coast of Terrebonne Parish. And one of the reasons why I said that if it involved my house and property, in this project, I wouldn't have nothing to do with it, is because 20 years ago, if one federal entity through the Corps of Engineers and Terrebonne Levee District didn't find the island worth saving because of the cost-benefit ratio factor, which was $190 million, well, 20 years later, how come another federal entity can come there and say, well, to make things better with climate change, we need to bulldoze your house? And it's like, no, that's not going to change what's going on to our environment. That this grant is a response to the changes of our environment and not the answer. Because as a whole, to meet the total challenges to the changes of the environment, it would take more than just $48 million and a resettlement. So so the traditional approach of the way HUD used to do things wouldn't be the answer. I have a helicopter getting ready to pass over. I'm sorry. Yeah, so the traditional way of doing things wouldn't apply to this resettlement.
Thank you. And before we run out of time, I'd like to ask my last question is, what would you tell other communities and their leaders who might have to go through this process in the future? What wisdom do you have for them?
Well, for that answer there, I really have to thank Chief Albert Nakan, the traditional chief of Allogene Charles, and that for the last 20 years, he had to deal with this harsh reality of a decision, not a conversation, but a decision of relocation. And so I really need to thank him on that, because he has really gone against the grain, and knowing well, him being from Allogene Charles, knowing well that nobody would never want to abandon the place or leave it, but that he had kept that going. And I thought about that throughout the last 20 years, not so much because of this project, but because of what he was advocating as a decision and not just a conversation. And so with that, this here can serve as an example as to what can be done in other communities. And that if something is done again in South Louisiana like this, is to always bear in mind that since we are Native Americans, that we are more sensitive to our land than what would be a typical move from a community that would say, well, look, I'm good to go. I have no ties to this land. I have no bearing. I'm good to go. I could sell it out, whatever, I'm good. But for us, that just don't apply like that. And it's still not a comfortable feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. So because of the reasons we discussed today, we recommend in forthcoming community resettlements, the continued access and ownership of the properties being left behind should be considered as a critical component for planning just retreats. We also, of course, recommend that authentic relationships are created between planners and the people most affected by the move. This is a paper that we just published in May about the topics that we discussed, if you would like to hear more. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much to the team. It's an amazing presentation, and just brought us sort of full circle and lots of issues. We're going to move on to the next presentation. So now we're moving slightly to the west. Revisioning a Resilient Oregon Coast, Co-Developing Alternative Futures for Adaptation Planning and Decision-Making, Climate and Decision-Making, Climate and Social Science for Managed Retreat. We have Peter Ruggiero presenting.
Thanks very much, William. And my name is Peter Ruggiero, and from Oregon State University. And I'd like to tell you about a project we refer to as Envisioning Resilient Coastal Futures, exploring a range of alternative scenarios for the Oregon coastline. I'd like to just start out by just pointing out this is a very collaborative, transdisciplinary effort with a variety of geomorphologists, coastal engineers, economists, many students involved, anthropologists and social scientists, extension folks as well. And for the last couple of years, we've been working very closely with a kind of very active advisory council on this project that involves the full suite of state partners that are really thinking about the range of adaptation and mitigation options allowable along the Oregon coast. So you can see the cast of characters here, so state partners, and a variety of community, county scale partners as well. Federal as well as NGO and other partners as well. So this is very much a kind of co-production effort, and we've developed a knowledge to action network with these folks. And so with this project, Envisioning Oregon's Coastal Futures, we're really trying to address the fact that the coast of Oregon is experiencing a suite of chronic coastal hazards today, very concerned about what that might look like in the future. And we're also susceptible to Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes and associated tsunamis, and a relatively decent percentage possibility of that happening within the next couple of decades. So really, the communities along the Oregon coast are exposed to a wide range of fairly serious coastal hazards. And so with this project, what we're really after is kind of thinking through ways to kind of envision a range of potential possible futures. And the idea is to inform coastal community decision-making towards a more resilient coastal future. The project at kind of its base has a coupled natural human systems modeling framework that allows us to explore population growth, changes to the built environment, housing and land market evolution. Within this modeling framework, we have a variety of models which we can model these hazards from the acute hazards of earthquakes and tsunami damage, as well as just chronic hazards associated with coastal erosion, flooding, sea level rise, et cetera. And with the group of people I mentioned earlier, as well as a couple of other projects that we're building on, where we've worked with communities throughout the Oregon coast, we're really gathering the suite of community perspectives to kind of envision a suite of policies, mitigation, adaptation options that we kind of package in a variety of policy scenarios that we explore in this modeling framework, okay? And this is just another way of kind of thinking about what we're doing. Kind of at the heart, we're trying to explore a range of potential futures. Keep things going as they are in terms of a baseline scenario, a set of policies that might protect infrastructure, clearly a manage retreat set of policies, restore, where we implement a lot of green infrastructure on the landscape in the modeling framework. And we've developed with these partners over the last several years a variety of resilience metrics in which we're exploring direct losses, indirect losses on the landscape, as well as looking through the lens of social equity. And again, as I mentioned, we're really looking at both chronic and acute coastal hazards. Okay, we got a variety of research objectives. I'm not going to read these, but again, alternative strategies for chronic and acute hazard mitigation. We're looking at distributional consequences, social equity, and consistent concerns. And we're really aiming to develop actionable knowledge with the advisory council that we have along the Oregon coast, and then ultimately to increase the community and state literacy and capacity for adaptation to these hazards. Okay, with the stakeholders that we've worked with over the suite of projects, we've developed a whole suite of these policy scenario narratives. And I'm just going to give you one example here that is very much aligned with the theme of this conference, Manage Retreat. In Oregon, we've referred to it as the Realign policy. So these are policies or decisions that are implemented that involve changing human activities to suit the changing environment. So this involves things like relocation of infrastructure and or people, and a variety of different policies get implemented into this scenario narrative. And basically, as I mentioned, we're at one time looking at both the chronic and acute hazards. From a climate perspective, we're looking at a range of low sea level rise projections through high sea level rise projections, again, based upon detailed conversations with stakeholders throughout the state. And then we're looking at these suite of policy scenarios, and also looking at a variety of implementation approaches from targeted policies to looking at potentially impacts to specific communities within the Oregon coast, or just untargeted policy implementation as well. And again, doing this from a climate perspective as well as from a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake perspective. Okay, and just before I give a couple of examples of some of the results that we get, I just wanted to show, again, we have a variety of individual policies. These are things like implementing hard engineering structures to beach nourishment, to things like hazard zone development restrictions or removing buildings. Each one of these individual policies are associated with some of these individual scenarios. We cross those scenarios with these different climate scenarios or different acute hazard scenarios. And then we're going to explore a range of resilience metrics. And I'm going to just give two examples, one from the chronic hazard side, and then I'm going to give one from the acute hazard side. And so from the perspective of chronic coastal hazards, we're looking at trade-offs between coastal protection and some of the recreation services that our beaches and dunes provide us. And so within the modeling framework, this coupled natural human systems modeling framework that I mentioned, we're able to model water level variability and erosion through time. We're able to see through developing triggers and again, detailed conversations with folks living in these communities, when certain property owners might armor their coastline, and we're able to, through time, again, with a variety of different policy scenarios, look at when areas of the coastline might actually armor. They can see this is one section of the coastal landscape that by 2060, our model is predicting the vast majority of that area would actually be armored by hard coastal engineering protection structures using a baseline scenario. So we're able to make that same kind of assessment, but instead of just looking at armoring, what might be the impact of the accessibility of that beach? So as without any renourishment and continued sea level rise, the same processes that are causing people to armor would actually cause a restriction in terms of the ability to actually access that beach because of high water levels. And we can explore that both in the present day scenario, as well as under a variety of different policy scenarios out into the future. And so we're really looking at this kind of trade-off between, again, coastal protection and the recreation services of the beach. And so we've done that in map view, and this modeling framework allows us to also explore this in time series view. So we're actually seeing here the percent of shoreline armored going forward through time, as well as the reduction associated with that with beach accessibility. And then these different colors on these maps basically show the difference between individual policy scenarios that are being explored through the modeling framework. And you can see this managed realignment or realign scenario has the least reduction in terms of beach accessibility, whereas protect type policy scenarios have the most reduction in terms of the beach accessibility metric, which is fairly obvious. All right, so the second example I'd like to just briefly give is one from the acute hazards. The coastal communities in Oregon are very concerned about the potential for what they're referring to as islanding or being disconnected from services and relief after a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami. And so we're exploring through our modeling framework things like what neighborhoods within different cities might have the longest post-event travel times to a variety of community assets. And so we've been looking at these community assets as distinctly different from the kind of traditional critical facilities of hospitals, fire stations, police stations. These are places where folks within the communities are definitely going to feel safe following a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. We're exploring what are the socioeconomic characteristics of these various communities that might have disproportional impacts following these events. And then really, the main focus is what policies could improve access to these community assets post-event. All right, and so the overall approach here is, again, with this coupled natural human systems modeling framework, we have a transportation network, a travel time model, and then an acute hazard model that is implemented on the landscape at any time within the next century. That damages buildings, it damages the road network, and it significantly affects travel times. And then we basically are modeling the recovery of the travel times as we go. And so we're doing a variety of community vulnerability analyses. These focus on understanding the potential impacts of this kind of Cascadia subduction zone earthquake on a variety of different population groups, assets to the community assets. And so these are some initial results from this kind of modeling perspective. And so these dots basically show the population and the associated travel time after a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake to a variety of different community assets. And here I'm just showing community centers and healthcare. And on this next slide, we're basically now exploring the influence of different demographics. So maybe we're interested in how folks over 65, how long it might take to get to community centers, or people under 5 years old, how long it might take them to get to schools. And then ultimately what the recovery process is through time. So we can make the model analyses be both before the event, one day after, and then multiple days up to a year after, and then explore potential disproportional impacts of different populations on the landscape. Okay, and so these are the kinds of results that this modeling framework allows us. And we have a variety of ongoing co-production discussions with our advisory council. So things like what types of policies can be targeted to increase community resilience from the perspectives of damage to infrastructure, connectivity, so this islanding framework, or community vulnerability. what types of community vulnerability analyses might be the highest priority. So thinking about housing, livelihood, supporting services. And then finally, we're really trying to explore both chronic and acute hazards. And are there adaptation or mitigation policies that might increase resilience to both of these hazards? And can we actually find basically policies that might actually work well under both kinds of hazard frameworks? And with that, I'll just say thanks very much for your attention.
Great, thanks so much. Great to see the Oregon coast in great detail like that. So I think I've finally figured out the Q&A process. I apologize. So we do have a couple of moderators, session moderators, who are getting comments from the audience and then translating them into our chat. There were 2 comments that came forward for the previous presentation. One of the questions has already been responded to, so that's great. Just for the session moderators, as those questions come in, try to translate them as quickly as possible into the chat so we can respond close to real time. So with that, I don't see any chat comments coming up just yet on this past presentation, but Peter, maybe you can keep a lookout for that, and of course we'll bundle some of that together, assuming that we'll have some time at the end of the session to kind of go through things. So thanks so much for that, and we'll move on to the next presentation. And this moves to the East Coast. I'm a geographer, so I'm thinking about where we're going in space sometimes. Social and physical dimensions of climate resiliency, a case study of environmental justice in the Bronx watershed. And actually, we have 3 presenters engaged with this. We have Maggie Greenfield. We also have Dariela Rodriguez and Kristin Murphy. I'm not sure who's going to speak first, but I'll give it over to you guys, and we'll move through the presentation with your lead.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Just want to make sure you can hear me before I start saying too much. Bill, can you give me a nod if you can hear me?
I can hear you. You're good.
Perfect. Okay, great. So yes, it's a really, thank you everyone so far for a fascinating panel. It's very cool to be going all around the country like this, and welcome to the Bronx for our presentation. I am Maggie Greenfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Bronx River Alliance. I'm also actually the Bronx River Administrator for New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. And that is because the Bronx River Alliance is a public-private partnership that emerged from community activism for the Bronx River with a mission to protect, improve, and restore the Bronx River so that it can be a healthy resource for the communities through which it flows. So as we all know, climate change is happening, and we all know that its impacts are really disproportionately being borne by environmental justice communities such as the South Bronx. So we're seeing things like extreme heat events, like we've been seeing in New York City, particularly Harlem and the South Bronx. And in addition, we're seeing that, racist land use policies have led to the disproportionate siting of polluting land uses, particularly along the waterfront, and now raise concerns about the potential for human exposure to toxic chemicals in the event of coastal flooding. We're seeing more and more extreme weather events, things like rain bombs and floods and hurricanes in our area that are already affecting communities of color more than others because they're overlaid over existing maladies in our communities. Things like poverty, poor air quality, lack of access to open space and clean water and air. So in the same way that we're seeing that COVID disproportionately hit communities of color, climate change is doing the same thing. So we make the case that adaptive strategies must be both targeted to and led by communities of color and environmental justice communities. And we're really happy to be here today to talk about some of the strategies being implemented in the South Bronx that include social components. And Dariela is going to be talking about their great work at the Point, as well as some of the physical interventions such as retreating along the shoreline, planned flooding, soil remediation, green infrastructure, and Kristin Murphy from the Bronx River team is going to present on that. And we think that these community-based initiatives along the Bronx River really illustrate the social and physical approaches and suggest ways that we can marry long-standing, deep partnerships that lead to collective action and community power. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dariella. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And I'm really glad to be here with you all. And in this really information intense presentations that I've been enjoying, what I think I can share more about is how an organization like the Point CDC in Hunts Point, which is known for not just like being in a very unique place in the South Bronx, but known for infrastructure and markets that exist in our neighborhood, that the infrastructure of our neighborhood and that the way that our neighborhood has been designed has put us in a situation, like Maggie said, that creates vulnerabilities at a higher rate than other places in our city. And that for many years, we've been looking at environmental justice work as our leading work, but that since Sandy, we had to look at how climate was impacting not just our where we live, but also impacting like the Hunts Point market and where we work, play, study, and all these things. So the next two slides actually kind of go into detail about like what those discussions looked like. And I won't bore you with the details of those discussions, but I think that there was evidence of what we have historically said, that our asset is our community, and that folks who are closest to the problems are also the folks that are closest to the solutions. So for us, what that means is that that the Point has been able to bring community together to look at the ways in which we are vulnerable and the issues that exist on our waterfront, but also look at opportunities and resources and ways that we can make our waterfront more resilient, not just by addressing climate and policy, but by also today building up the capacity of our community. And that led to the development, together with the Department of Health and some other community partners across the city, in developing a program called the Be a Buddy program, which what it does is builds the community of community members and partners them up with who we see as the most vulnerable in our community. And for 2 years, as we were going through the pilot of this program, the most vulnerable was defined by seniors who were living on life-altering medication, and understanding that people who had machines that they needed to be alive, potentially, right, like life-saving machines, could be at higher risk during a blackout that could be caused by heat and by climate related emergencies. So that we needed to merge our waterfront work and our work around resiliency around the waterfront, not just for emergencies and storms and physical climate related emergencies, but that heat and other climate issues that we're facing can cause emergencies that can make people in our community even more vulnerable. And that in order to not just address policies and not just address infrastructure, but to understand these conditions better, we needed to develop a group of people in our community that were directly connected with these folks who were most vulnerable. Since COVID, we have redefined what vulnerable means, understanding that young people are more vulnerable, that people who have asthma are more vulnerable, and that there's no age for that we're at higher risk for those things. So we've been using the Be a Buddy program as almost like a launching pad for a lot of our environmental justice work and our resiliency work, really understanding that all these things are connected by their root causes, and that in order to really address climate and in order to address environmental justice, we needed to understand those root causes and do things on the ground now as we were looking at bigger picture solutions. So I could show the next slide. As we developed our team of Via Buddies, we looked at like our personal powers and what are the powers that our community members have, and then like partnered that with what are the ways that we can train folks so that they can respond and be helpful to community members. So we've looked at not only like heat trainings and understanding heat, but also like drug overdose trainings, winter preparedness and emergency preparedness trainings. And we're looking at before the next winter season, starting to do community drills that really let us know like when is it important to stay inside our home, when is it important to evacuate, what do we do in case of a blackout during COVID, what do we do in a heat emergency during COVID. So for us, that has been kind of like one of the biggest ways that we incorporate like human development and developing leaders, and how we can play a role in resiliency in our community, but also teaming that up with like our policy work, infrastructure work, and community organizing and visioning in the future.
Great, thanks, Nari. Yeah, so as Maggie mentioned before, the Bronx River Alliance is continuing the effort of undoing a lot of the legacy issues of environmental justice, or injustice rather, that are present across the South Bronx. And so in terms of flood risk from sea level rise and protecting our waterfront, there's a lot of green infrastructure work the Bronx River Alliance has done in recent years to increase the resiliency of these vulnerable communities in the South Bronx. So first, what I want to highlight is the restoration of the Atlantic oyster. And so we know that traditionally and historically, New York City was the capital for oysters, if not in the entire country, or the entire world, excuse me, at least the country. We had the most robust oyster reefs, the largest oysters that you could find anywhere. And through dredging and pollution and overharvesting, we basically got rid of our oysters. And one of the most amazing things that oysters do is they provide this twofold protection, where they both purify water by filtering out a lot of pollutants, which increases dissolved oxygen levels and makes the water healthier for the wildlife that lives there. But they also physically build structures. And so oysters build these reefs, like a coral reef, which acts as a natural wave break. And so one of the things that we're doing with our partners down in Soundview, which is at the mouth of the Bronx River, we are restoring the oyster. So we've been putting in oyster cages and monitoring the development of spat, so we can see how well the oysters are reproducing, how much the reef is increasing in size on a year-by-year basis, with the goal that eventually the reef will be large enough to actually protect these communities from storm energy during hurricanes. And one of the reasons why this is really significant is because of the Hunts Point distribution market, which is the largest food distribution market of its kind on Earth, which is located at sea level in Hunts Point at the mouth of the river, and is very vulnerable to flooding. So this is not just an issue that's impacting the Bronx, but actually the New York City metro area really does depend on this facility. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is just to protect the shorefront here. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through the use of these oysters. And so we involve our community members in this monitoring as well, to raise awareness of the issue, to get them more hands-on experience and get them a sense of stewardship and what it means to actually protect their communities. Next slide, please. I also want to highlight one of our most successful habitat restoration efforts on the Bronx River. This is just around the corner from the oyster reef. This is Soundview Park. This is the Soundview Park salt marsh. And so back in the day, it was sort of this degraded, polluted, exposed patch of shorefront. Didn't have any really plants growing there. The homes that were located in these neighborhoods around this part of the Long Island Sound were very exposed to storms. And so this area would flood very, very frequently and cause a lot of damage and impact the lives of the community members that live there. And so what we did was we actually put back the salt marsh. So these were sort of plants and different kind of sediment structures that you would have found in this area hundreds of years ago. And this is acting as a natural buffer against flooding and storm surges for these residents. And it also doubles as a beautiful, beautiful park full of wildlife. And so it's a space where the community can go to relax and recreate and enjoy, but it's also protecting, again, it's acting as a natural buffer against the storm energy. And lastly, I just want to mention the Bronx River Greenway. and the work that the Bronx River Alliance does on this Greenway. So essentially what our Greenway is a series of connected parks along the Bronx River. It actually stretches the entire length of the Bronx River. And what we're trying to do is just fill in all the little gaps and make this as continuous as possible. But one of the things that happens is we're increasing and beautifying the Greenway is that it's improving access to green spaces on the waterfront. It's improving the actual resiliency of these areas. And so what we've done is we've moved industrial facilities and industrial lots away from the river so that we can put in these parks and other green infrastructure. And what that's done is it's again helped to create this natural buffer along the river, where historically you had concrete plants and gas and oil refineries, which were right on the water's edge and were, at risk from flooding. And so it's something that's happened across New York City and across many cities in the country, where we build right next to waterfronts because it's easy access for transportation. But what we didn't think back in the 20th century was that these areas were going to get destroyed, if a hurricane comes through. And so what we're doing is we're continuing to move a lot of these sensitive areas out of the way and putting in parks and green spaces, which are again acting as this sort of sponge, this buffer against sea level rise. And so as we're talking about managed retreat, and as we're trying to work out these logistics, which are time consuming and really difficult, we're trying to buy some time by protecting these vulnerable communities and giving them a space that they can be proud of and that they can enjoy. So that's some of our physical work. Thank you again so much for the opportunity to share with you all. If you are interested in learning more about what our two organizations do, I just encourage you to visit our website, bronxriver.org or thepoint.org. Yeah, we're doing a lot of great work, and we're really trying to help our communities of the South Side. So thank you so much for allowing us to share with you all today.
Great, thanks so much. Really impressive work. There is a question for all the presenters in the chat about the definition of successive disaster relocation. Just to note that. Great stuff for the Bronx. So I'll be the next presenter. If someone could, I sort of have my time keep with me, but if somebody wants to sort of tell me to shut up as well at some point after 12 minutes, or please do so. All right. So let me go to presentation. So thanks for the opportunity to not only moderate, but also say a few words in this process. I want to say as a caveat, this work was significantly impacted by COVID because it was field-based sort of face-to-face interviews that was started basically in early 2020. So the caveat here is that it is still a work in progress, and we've had to kind of restructure. We're literally finally being able to go back out into the field. So, but the overall title, Community Response to Local Coastal Resilience Programs, results of a household survey in the Metropolitan New York region. So we're moving from the Bronx a little further out. Let's see, how do I, oops, there we go. So, some of these things are really well known by the group, but basically a lot of these efforts, resiliency, local resiliency, community resiliency efforts developed by governments are often complicated by a whole set of factors. They're also, even more contentious things like, buyouts and so forth, of course, are, have heightened levels of complexity. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about in the context of the New York metropolitan region is particularly post Sandy in 2012, there've been a number of different initiatives developed. There's been some buyout programs. There's been a whole series of resiliency efforts, a lot occurring at the local level. The question that we have is, well, how effective are these sorts of programs? What's the level of engagement? What do people know about it? What are some of the barriers from the perspective, both of the policymakers and then also the individuals in which they're sort of focused on, in this case, mostly household members or homeowners. And one of the things we wanted to try to do is to kind of get into an interplay by doing some discussions, some workshops with some of the policymakers, trying to get a sense of how they saw their own programs working, what they felt were some of the barriers, what were some of their knowledge needs, and that in a way kind of helped form a survey that then we took to household members And then through the survey process, we were able to provide some information about some of these local programs, but also in turn gather some information that would be relevant back to the stakeholders, the practitioners and policymakers. The area of focus is explicitly not the city of New York, but it's coastal Long Island, and then also parts of the coastal area of New Jersey. We wanted to look at a variety of settings, some of the older, sort of closer in, so to speak, urban communities along the waterfront or along the water's edge, some currently sort of suburban areas further out, and then also kind of an exurban coastal community in each one of those sites. So I'm going to be basically reporting on one of the completed surveys to date, and then sort of go through some of the details results of the survey. So I think, again, some background information, which I know many of you are familiar with, but what are some of the factors that, that build capacity for resiliency efforts, planning, prospects, and also maybe more transformative adaptation, which I would potentially bucket, manage retreat into. Of course, this issue of effective communication strategy, sort of getting the word out, engaging with community members, sort of coming at the issue in terms of a co-production, sort of a basis of equity, a notion of how to formulate a process of engagement and decision-making or governance that's sort of understood and transparent. But that being said, also recognizing the role and importance of individual experiences, the question of place affinity. We've already heard reflections of this throughout the session today. And so what we're trying to do with this survey is assess some of the role and significance of these factors in the context of how people have gained understanding about some of the resiliency efforts that have now developed, to some level, full flower, but still evolving in coastal Long Island and coastal New Jersey now, 8 plus years from Hurricane, actually almost 9+ years, I'm sorry, from Hurricane Sandy. And then also, develop a research process that could simultaneously provide some information for decision makers as well as for the households. So what we did then is, as I mentioned, these workshops, we did a series of workshops, one workshop in coastal Long Island, one workshop in coastal New Jersey, gathering information from practitioners and policymakers in a several-hour session, trying to sort of understand how they saw their resiliency efforts, what they saw some of the impediments are, what they saw some of their data needs. Developed a survey, and then executed the survey, and then sort of in the process sort of bringing that back into the practitioner and policymaker discussion. So this is just like some of the results of these surveys. We also had partners with individuals at Stony Brook University and Monmouth University in New Jersey. And it was very edifying to kind of really talk with, and I know many of you folks are in these positions, but to sort of let people reflect, at least for a little while, on the efficiency and effectiveness of their programs, what's working, what's not. And some of the, I'll just very briefly kind of touch on some of the issues. I mean, certainly the question of environmental justice, that there was, there wasn't enough engagement, on this front, and there needs to be a greater understanding of what's the impact of risk, and also some of these resiliency efforts on the well-being of the communities. There's a recognition that the risk varies a lot across the municipalities, but really there's still a lack of understanding about how that experience is being taken up in individual households, and how that might influence the success of various proposals. There's a sort of a recognition that there's a variety of different sort of homeowners in this sort of coastal zone. So it's in this sort of transition space. There's a lot of, all year residences, but there are also some part-time residences, vacation, et cetera. So it's a very complicated setting to sort of understand, who exactly the practitioners and policymakers are going to be engaging with, because some of the population is very transitory. There's just a need for understanding. There's a lot of their experiences with respect to gray infrastructure, but really wanted to know a little bit more about what some of the green infrastructure initiatives were, how they were being developed, and whether or not they were of interest to households. And then just generally more data about metrics of success and sort of uptake of some of the results of their work. Again, not a lot of, some evaluation was taking place, but more evaluation needed to take place. So we use these kinds of results to develop a survey that sort of tried to reflect some of these pieces in three different buckets. So one was on risk perception and risk management strategies that the households were developing. A little bit about what conditions were influencing their ability or interest in engaging in resiliency efforts. And then what factors might influence how these local community stakeholders understand the effectiveness of the programs, the strategies, and activities. So we use that as a general kind of portfolio of issues to sort of then define some specific survey questions. So as I mentioned, we wanted to look at 6 sites, 3 in coastal Long Island and 3 in coastal New Jersey. We were significantly delayed. Basically, we were not able to go out in the field. The City University of New York and the other universities were basically forbidding field-based work for much of last year. And it's really only more recently that things have relaxed. So we're really basically going to be looking at just one community, but this is just a sample shot of intense development along the Jersey Shore and the Long Island shores. Mostly single-family homes, although increasingly in other contexts, some larger multifamily developments are occurring along the coast. There's a lot of incision and sort of cutting into the landscape to sort of increase access, of course, to the waterway, which enhances amenities and property values, but of course also increases potential exposures. So the area that we're looking at specifically in the context of these survey results are in coastal Long Island, the Amityville village, which is part of New York State, in New York State, but as part of the Babylon town. It's about 9,000 or so residents, mostly single-family homes, middle and upper class community in general, a community, about 75% non-Hispanic white. The other communities have different profiles. What this chart, this graphic illustrates is the extent of Sandy surge extent. And so what you can see, of course, is that the areas in question that we surveyed were all affected directly by Hurricane Sandy. So what I'm going to do now in the remaining time is just kind of go through some of the results, kind of highlight some of the details, and then sort of bring forward potential questions if folks have. So just some basic results. What are people concerned about? Storms and coastal storm surges are number one. You can see the red outline. Really, other issues emerging are not really quite significant at the moment. This is kind of an interesting one. How much risk has changed over the past 10 years? And you look at the orange and red bars, and what you're seeing is that there's a sense that amongst many of the respondents that the amount of risk has increased, but there isn't a real sense how much do you think your property will face in the future. There really isn't a sense that risk level will change, which is sort of interesting. Then we get into the question of value, property values. How much do you feel the coastal flood risk has affected the value of your property? In general, a vast majority of people had a strong negative or moderate negative effect. So it's recognized that this is sort of already something that's influencing their potential, the value of their properties, which gives you some indication of level of concern. Although again, when you look at how much it will change from now into the future, there's a recognition that their property will be at risk and somewhat very much at risk, but it doesn't really sort of show a lot of significant change over that time period. If you look at this next question, which of the following reflects your opinion regarding the next 30 years? And this is probably most disappointing to some of the managers that we've talked with. The largest percentage of folks in the gray, flood risk will increase, but resiliency programs won't be able to protect property. So there's not a lot of faith in some of these. There's obviously a lot of people are not really quite sure, and a much smaller percent think that they're actually going to have some impact. But this is sort of a kind of a telling statement in terms of how they think that some of these efforts are going on post-Sandy. What I want to do is shift a little bit to sort of like their engagement with some of these resiliency programs. And this question is, to what extent do you feel that the current resiliency programs have influenced your decision-making process? And I think that the most startling result here is the blue band here, 42%, didn't know about them, and so it did not influence my thinking. So this is, in a context where there's been, they were flooded, there's been a very aggressive sort of effort by the local communities to get the word out, but still almost half the population didn't know. And then another larger percent, 23%, said knew about them, but didn't really influence me very much at all. In this context, we're asking which of the following government activities have you participated in, and what degree do you think they were helpful? So in general, you can see the blue is illustrating that there's really a lack of knowledge. The only thing that they really knew much more about was the cell phone alerts, the warnings and updates. Those they thought were helpful, but for the most part, the rest of it was not yet sort of seen as a really obvious strategy. What is your opinion about the usefulness of the following resiliency strategies? So these are a range of different sort of initiatives. Again, these are the ones that the tools, the main toolkits that the practitioners felt like they had in their box. And of all of them, the financial incentives for flood mitigation in general was seen as being the most helpful. The buyout plan option was seen as not particularly helpful, although sort of ranked not too much different from some of the other initiatives. The most important was the financial incentives for flood mitigation. I'll just close off with a few other statements: factors influencing engagement in resiliency programs. So this is another interesting question. So which do you feel is taking the lead, in some of these initiatives? And again, this is, a little bit trying to get a sense of what's their perspective. In general, they felt like the federal government was really taking the lead, and secondarily, the local government, 25%, and the state of New York, 19%. And it's really a kind of a mixed picture, because there's certainly all these three entities sort of involved, but obviously the federal government, which on the ground, if you're a real critical reviewer of the policies, wouldn't be the main player, but by far it was seen as the most significant player. And then this kind of feeds off of that. Which one would you most likely trust and engage with of all those? So there was, commensurate sort of engagement with the federal government, the local government, not much trust of the state government, even though they felt like they were sort of significant players in this process, which is not something, it's very much sort of similar to what you see in other contexts on Long Island. The state is sort of seen as far away and not particularly helpful. Although in the context of some of the big initiatives, really the state is a major player. And then following up, just which of the following factors influence your capacity and ability to engage with government-initiated flood resiliency programs, and to what degree? Again, a mixture of responses. It doesn't meet our family's needs, doesn't lead to the desired outcomes. A lot of sort of kind of potential responses, but in general, the issue of cost really came up as most significant, although there were many that sort of also had were also similar in that category. And then the last couple of questions I want to highlight sort of spoke about the future and trying to get a sense of what their perspective was in terms of what they were thinking next. Again, remember, these were places that are right on the water's edge, certainly within the 1% flood zone, certainly had been inundated with Sandy, certainly had been the focus of a lot of resiliency and sort of recovery efforts since that time. So we asked the question, how many Hurricane Sandy-like events do you think you'd be willing to endure over the next decade before considering leaving your current home? So, it was interesting to recognize, there's a certain sliver, about 5%, who are already planning to leave. That's a vast minority, but then about half of the folks felt like they were sort of teetering on the edge a little bit. Like, if we get another storm like that, that's going to sort of change my thinking about, whether or not I want to be here. Of course, then there was another, about a third of the population basically saying, we're here, we're staying, or we're not going. So real dichotomy in the context of the communities. And then one of the other things that have been always of interest to me is this issue of place affinity and how well connected you are. Of course, that'll affect whether or not you'll want to leave and could leave under conditions of duress or any conditions. And so what you see here, option 4 in the orange color for me is probably around 70+% of the folks felt like they were very well connected to their community. And in turn, it gives the implication that they might want to stay. So let me just wrap up. Hopefully I haven't gone over, but looking at this one case, there's a lot of wide variation in responses. There is some kind of general consistent sort of findings. One is that the folks don't know a lot about what the coastal resiliency programs are currently underway, even though the state, the local, and some cases the feds have been fairly aggressive in this domain. It was kind of an interesting sort of tension, which is highlighted in red here. The vast majority felt that the level of flood risk would increase, yet remain sort of very attached to their homes and neighborhoods. So that's sort of like that conundrum that we've seen in other contexts. And with respect to sort of more aggressive programs such as managed retreat, it was clear that another storm of significance might be a tipping point in terms of how people think and decide whether or not to engage in those sorts of activities. So next steps, we're doing some statistical works, just on some of this survey work, but more excitingly, we're getting the teams back out. We had to reconfigure the survey because it's going to be done differently. And then hopefully those will be distributed both as an online and sort of self-administered survey later this summer, and hopefully be able to report more results coming back to you soon. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. And I hope I haven't gone too long. We'll see. But let me go on to the next presentation. And the final presentation in our set, Building Community Consensus for Flood Risk Adaptation. And we have 2 presenters, Bennett Brooks and Nate Mitchell, and who'll be sort of tag teaming back and forth.
Okay, so it's really great to be together with everybody here this morning, or it's morning East Coast time, but it sounded like somebody else was in an afternoon time zone earlier. So what we're looking at here is a picture of the pier in Piermont, and that's where we get our name from. We have an artificially constructed pier that was originally the terminus for the Erie Railroad. And we also have mountains on 2 sides and the Sparkill Creek that runs through the Piermont Marsh alongside us. So this project we put together a couple of years ago was a way to try to develop a consensus conversation in some of our neighborhoods that are more dramatically affected by sea level rise risks than others. So I need to just acknowledge the support that we had from CBI and Cornell University and the American Arbitration Association, Scenic Hudson, Neshman Consulting, and the Hudson River Estuary Program. Slide. So Piermont's a tiny little place. We're just a couple of miles up the Hudson River from some of the last 2 presentations. We have about 2,500 residents. People have been drawn here partly because of our close association with the creek, the marsh, and the river. But we happen to be an area that was largely built on landfill. And so there's a lot of very low level areas. 52.5% of Piermont, geographically speaking, is at risk of a 1% flood, which is the highest in the county. And we have a population that's very civically engaged and a lot of really robust conversations about adaptation. But this is a situation where there is no simple panacea solution. And so we have done a lot of talking, but we have no real path forward for long-term risk at this point. This project was designed to try to shape what kind of a path forward would be something that our residents could buy into. And with that, I'll hand it off to Bennett.
Great, thanks, Nate, and good afternoon, everybody. Bennett Brooks with Consensus Building Institute. So our challenge was, how do we have this conversation? How do we get people to talk about long-term risk? And our thinking was, our hypothesis was that we needed to do it in a way that was personal, that was relevant, that was tangible and credible, and do it in a way that would integrate sort of people's individual aspirations, neighborhood aspirations, and community aspirations, because all of that has to come together if this is going to work. So we did a few different things to try to get at those pieces. First of all, we created what we call neighborhood liaisons. And so these were people from the local neighborhoods, the ones that had the flooding risk. And their job really were to sort of be almost ambassadors from the conversation we wanted to have to their neighbors. And they helped us to organize and facilitate. They were sort of the trusted neighborhood point of contact. They were the messenger back and forth. They were the people knocking on doors. And they really helped create energy and get people together. It's also really important to highlight what they weren't. And this was important both to the liaisons and to their neighbors. They were not there because they were subject experts. They were not there because they would have more voice in any kind of decision. They were not decision makers. And so that gave the liaisons comfort and gave the neighbors comfort. We also needed to come up with ways to make the information around risk and the adaptation options tangible and relevant and personal. And we did that in a couple of ways. One was creating sort of at a not too high a level, at a neighborhood scale, help people see what's the risk, what is likely coming their way. And this map just shows a couple of points in a couple of neighborhoods that were familiar to them, pointing out at a particular house, at a particular intersection or parking lot, what is the flood depth likely to be in different scenarios, storm surges or sunny day flooding? And it was a way to just sort of situate people literally in their neighborhood so they could begin to understand what was coming their way. Another way we did that, and I think, at least from my perspective, was critical, was creating a individual flood risk profile. Nava Tabak with Tina Cousin was instrumental in doing this, and she created for any single homeowner that wanted to do it, basically a spreadsheet that would tell them at a glance. It looked at flooding over a 40-year horizon, which seemed to be enough time to understand the flooding and also sort of close to what a life of a mortgage might be. It looked at sunny day flooding. It looked at different storm types. And then it gave them a glimpse just looking at sunny day flooding. If you can see this in 2020, sunny day flooding 14 to 64 days. By 2060, it's almost up to 348 days a year. So people could see what's likely to be happening on my street, in my yard, on my first floor, in my basement, and really start to grasp that. We didn't force this information on anyone. If you wanted it, we gave it to you. Tough conversations. I felt like Nava was sitting with people almost like a counselor at points, but very important. We also created a personal risk worksheet, which we asked people to do away from the table, to sit with the really hard questions around attachment to home, capacity to recover from a flood, ability to plan to mitigate flood risk or relocate. Not many people did it. I think we all think this is really important. It's almost like we were envisioning the survey you get from your financial advisor who gives you a profile and says, all right, what's your risk profile? Are you ready to roll the dice, or do you want to just invest in treasury bills? We think something that this will be really important going forward. I'd love to see people keep pushing at this because we do think having people sit with this is really important. Lastly, I'm just going to hit this lightly. Bill Neckerman with Neckerman Consulting, who's the former New York State floodplain manager, was phenomenal at getting his arms around all the government assistance and all the different programs that are out there and trying to translate for people in a really easy to digest way, kind of how does that whole world relate to what they might do. And so this is just one example. The left column is showing all the different measures that someone might do. And this says, if you wanted to make a particular change, is this something you could do on your own? Is it something you have to do collectively with your neighbors? How long is it gonna, how much is it gonna help? Is it just a quick fix or a long-term fix? Are there government programs to support it? So anyway, the point here is just being able to distill this into bite-sized chunks was incredibly helpful. Happy to talk with more about any of this, but Nate, back to you to talk a little bit about, so what happened?
Okay, sure. So the good news out of this is that we really did build connections between neighbors that have maintained even throughout the COVID pandemic. So a couple of the neighborhoods that participated have already had follow-up meetings without the support of CBI directly, where the liaisons acted as the meeting facilitators themselves. And so that really has kind of built up some of their personal skill set and confidence level with the conversation. And several of them also have come to the village board that I serve as a trustee on and presented concepts and questions about what kind of village support would be available for adaptation options. So they're asking, and that's good. The conversation is still ongoing. And one of the things that shifted a lot from just post Sandy until post this project is that the subject is a lot less taboo. So there was a time period in Piermont where if you brought this up, people threw things at you. And at this point, we have people in affected neighborhoods that are having rational, reasonable conversations with each other about what is a kind of scary prospect. So another thing that was a benefit was that some of the participants in this project have seen that there is a role, a civic role in local government that's going to be important in how we find our, best outcomes adapting to sea level rise. And so people have gotten involved. We have one participant who's now a member of our planning board, which is an all volunteer board. And myself, I'm actually running for mayor at this point. I've been trustee for about 3 years. But a big part of that is seeing how there's an immediacy to the need and an immediacy to, the need for the village to take action on those fronts. One of the other things that is now explicitly on the table that was kind of wishy-washy before is that at least one of the neighborhoods, people are seriously considering the prospect of retreat. And at the village level, we're looking at what kinds of ways we can expand that conversation and present information and resources to those folks to be able to move forward with that. So the individual property specific risk profiles that were put together for this project are things that people actually have now in their house file. And there are things that they pull out and look at. And we've referred back to them in conversations about how does that really impact my property versus your property. And it's very valuable information. So I think that's one of the elements of this that was the most impactful and something that should be replicated. Slide. So now in terms of village level engagement, we have legislated a new advisory opinion letter. So when the site development plan comes to our planning board for approval, one of the advisory opinions that they can ask for is a Piermont Waterfront Resiliency Commission letter of recommendation or listing out concerns with the project that should be addressed from a flood damage prevention perspective. And so that's officially part of our planning process now. And that's something that other communities have looked at and said that could be something we could expand to. Another thing it allowed us to do is because of the support from the residents who came and presented to the board, I was able to convince the board that we should make a small investment in hiring a consultant to help us out with our application to the NFIP community rating system program. And a lot of the material that was put together for the Liaisons project, it turns out is actually appropriate to a program within CRS where you can get credit for outreach programs that include specific information and are formatted a specific way. So this isn't just stuff we put together that we're getting one, shot at the apple. We're repurposing a lot of it and we'll take value from it moving forward for some time. Another thing that's kind of a big deal and that I alluded to before is that this project also got the attention and support of the Nature Conservancy, who were not direct partners in the project itself, but at this point, the village is working with them to try to flesh out how they can use their resources from a legal perspective and from familiarity with buyouts to help us not just in terms of buying out homes that'll be affected by sea level rise, but the elephant in the room, helping us acquire land that can be used as a place to migrate to. And so I'm really optimistic about where we can go with it from here, because that was kind of the missing picture was where do we put them? So now we're working on it on both ends. Where do we put them and where they need to go from? And so overall, I think that it was an excellent approach to trying to engage individuals on a very real level about what the situation is, what steps they can take, and what steps we should all take together. So I heard a number of things in previous presentations that that sort of really clicked with this in my mind. The surveys, for example, this was kind of like a survey, but at a much more individual level. And the other thing that I just saw a big parallel to is that one of the programs we put together with the Waterfront Resiliency Commission is what we call our neighbor to neighbor program. And it had a lot of similarities to the Be a Buddy program in that what it was about was identifying volunteer leaders in each community with which there was some overlap to people that were willing to be neighborhood liaisons in this project. And those volunteer leaders take responsibility for in a flood event, they'll go and visit their neighbors or pick up the phone and call them and make sure that they're okay and they don't need medical attention or evacuation help or something like that. And it also includes a messaging component where we send out text messages and emails when there is a storm surge event coming up. And the one thing I wanted to mention about that is that when the COVID pandemic hit, we actually repurposed that network to have those community team leaders go and check in on folks that may have needed food or medicine and weren't able to leave the house because of the pandemic. And so it's really grown from something that we thought was about flooding into something which is just about working with your neighbors to try to benefit everyone in the community. And I think that that's something that a lot of communities could do well with. We're a lot smaller than the Bronx, but I think the same concept is still viable there.
Great. Nice, Nate. Thanks all. Appreciate
Great.
it. Go back to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much. That was the last presentation in our set. And I just want to thank all the presenters. I mean, just an amazing, rich variety of thoughts and perspectives and work going on. It's sort of illustrative of how this community has grown and evolved even over the last couple of years. Also, I want to apologize. I realized looking at the chat, I went over. I honestly didn't see the chat, so I'm going to throw myself at your mercy. I was trying to not go long, but I obviously did, so I apologize for that. The session formally has ended, but the session will remain open if there are issues or questions that others want to address, and for those in the audience who want to put forward questions to the presenters. Maybe I'll just, I myself will have to leave because I have a hard stop and need to go to another thing, but it really makes me excited to sort of come to the other sessions during this meeting. But maybe I'll throw it open to other presenters who want to sort of say any kind of quick comments or thoughts. I see there's another question that's come into the chat or some comment in the chat, but anything else from folks? Yeah, better. Yeah, lots of hard stops out there. It's sort of I have to wing myself into yet another Zoom room. But maybe we'll bring it to a close. Maybe I'll pause for a moment and go to our hosts, our session hosts. What do you think there's any lag time that the folks should sort of remain here while questions are being written? And you guys can come online if you want. Autumn, what do you think?
We're good. So I'll go ahead and I can transition to our end screen right now, and I'll account for the lag. And I'll leave the chat open. So for people waiting for Q&A still, we'll continue to post those there.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for your help and assistance, and also Brianna as well. I think she's been in the background. Okay. Thanks so much. Hope to see you again in some other sessions coming up soon. Take care. I'm hopping away.